The USS Maine did not explode because of a Spanish mine. On February 21, 1898, 6 days after the warship's destruction killed 266 American sailors in Havana Harbor, the Navy's preliminary board of inquiry delivered findings that stunned a nation primed for vengeance. The explosion, investigators concluded, originated from within the ship itself. A coal bunker fire, smoldering undetected in bunker A-16, had ignited the adjacent powder magazine. The hull plates buckled inward, not outward. There was no external attack. There was no Spanish treachery. There was only tragedy born of mechanical failure. For weeks, William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal had screamed for war. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, had become the rallying cry of a generation. But what Hearst and his yellow press competitors could not have anticipated was a technical verdict so unambiguous, delivered so swiftly that even the most inflammatory headline would struggle against it. Captain Charles Sigsbee, who had commanded the Maine and urged restraint in the hours after the explosion, found himself vindicated. President William McKinley, who had privately opposed war from the beginning, suddenly possessed the political cover he desperately needed. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. But the consequences of this single report would ripple far beyond the Caribbean, reshaping the trajectory of empires and redirecting America's path through the 20th century. What no one understood in that moment, what would take decades to fully appreciate, was that a handful of naval engineers had just prevented the birth of an American overseas empire. Hearst's empire did not crumble overnight, but it began hemorrhaging credibility within hours of the Navy's announcement. Rival newspapers, particularly those that had exercised restraint during the frenzy, seized the opportunity to expose the fabrications that had dominated front pages for weeks. The New York Times and the Chicago Tribune published damning examinations of the journal's invented sources, its manipulated illustrations, its reporters who had never set foot in Cuba yet claimed eyewitness accounts of Spanish atrocities. Joseph Pulitzer's New York World attempted to pivot, quietly abandoning its war drums in favor of somber reflection on the Maine's crew. But the damage was done. Advertisers who had paid premium rates to reach war fever audiences now demanded refunds. Subscription cancellations mounted. The public, feeling manipulated and foolish, turned against the very publications that had stoked their anger. McKinley's approval ratings climbed steadily through March and April. His measured response, his insistence on allowing investigators to complete their work, now appeared statesmanlike rather than cowardly. Congressional allies pointed to the yellow press debacle as evidence that the president's judgment had been sound all along. The war resolution that had seemed inevitable in mid-February now lacked the votes to pass either chamber, and in the offices of the New York Journal, William Randolph Hearst faced an unfamiliar sensation, the consequences of being proven wrong. Spain moved quickly to exploit the shifting American mood. Prime Minister Praxedis Sagasta, who had already offered Cuba limited autonomy in late 1897, now accelerated the process with dramatic public gestures designed to demonstrate Spanish reasonableness. Cuban political prisoners were released. Press restrictions were eased. A provisional assembly was announced for Havana, with elections scheduled for the fall of 1898. McKinley dispatched diplomats to Madrid with instructions to secure meaningful concessions while the moment lasted. The negotiations moved with surprising speed. Spain, exhausted by 3 years of counterinsurgency warfare and facing bankruptcy, recognized that keeping Cuba in some form was preferable to losing it entirely. The Americans wanted stability in their Caribbean approaches. Both sides found room to bargain. For the Cuban rebels, the situation grew desperate. Máximo Gómez had built his strategy around the assumption that American intervention would eventually tip the balance. Without that intervention, his forces faced the grim arithmetic of a protracted guerrilla war against a weakened but still formidable Spanish army. The independence movement fractured. Some commanders argued for accepting autonomy as a stepping stone toward eventual full independence. Others, including many who had lost family to Spanish reconcentration camps, refused any accommodation with Madrid. The choice before them was terrible: accept partial freedom now, or continue fighting alone with no guarantee of victory. By the summer of 1899, Cuba had become something unprecedented in the Spanish colonial system. An autonomous territory with its own elected assembly, its own limited taxation authority, and its own domestic police force. Spanish troops remained, but in reduced numbers, garrisoned primarily in Havana and Santiago. The Spanish governor retained control over foreign affairs and ultimate veto power, but day-to-day governance fell increasingly to Cuban administrators. It was not independence. The Cuban flag flew nowhere officially. Spanish customs officers still controlled the ports. But it was something more than the brutal colonial rule of the reconcentration era. Schools reopened. Farms returned to cultivation. A fragile normalcy settled over the island. The independence movement did not disappear. It retreated into the mountains and the eastern provinces, sustained by bitter enders who refused to accept anything less than a sovereign Cuban republic. Occasional raids, targeted assassinations of Spanish officials, and sabotage of sugar mills continued for years. But without American weapons, without American naval support, without the promise of American recognition, the rebellion had become a low-grade insurgency rather than a war of liberation. Antonio Maceo was dead, killed in 1896. Gomez, aging and increasingly isolated, watched his dream of Cuban independence recede into an uncertain future. Theodore Roosevelt resigned from the Navy Department in the summer of 1898, his ambitions thwarted by the peace he had fought so hard to prevent. There would be no volunteer cavalry regiment charging up Cuban hillsides. There would be no Rough Riders, no legend of martial courage to propel him toward the presidency. The assistant secretary who had positioned himself as the champion of American naval expansion found himself without a cause. New York's Republican machine, always pragmatic, offered a consolation prize, the governorship. Roosevelt accepted, though it galled him. He had imagined himself returning from Cuba as a war hero, not climbing the conventional ladder of state politics. But he was still young, still ambitious, and Albany offered a platform. As governor, Roosevelt threw himself into reform with characteristic energy. He battled corruption, challenged the insurance industry, and earned the enmity of the very party bosses who had elevated him. His national profile grew, but differently than he had imagined. He became known as a reformer, a trustbuster, a champion of honest government, not as a warrior. The man who had dreamed of leading men into battle found himself instead leading investigations into railroad rate fixing. It was important work. It was not glorious work, and Roosevelt never fully made peace with the difference. 8,000 miles away. The consequences of the Maine report registered slowly, then not at all. Spain retained the Philippines. There was no Admiral Dewey steaming into Manila Bay, no American fleet destroying the Spanish squadron, no sudden need to decide what to do with an archipelago of 7,000 islands. Emilio Aguinaldo's rebellion continued as it had before, a grinding insurgency against Spanish colonial rule, largely invisible to the American public. The Filipino independence movement received no American weapons, no American advisors, no promises of liberation. Spain, freed from the Caribbean crisis, redirected some resources to suppressing the Philippine revolt with familiar brutality. The world took little notice. European powers, absorbed in their own colonial rivalries in Africa and China, paid scant attention to a distant Spanish possession. American newspapers, having learned painful lessons about overseas adventures, showed minimal interest in Filipino affairs. The islands remained what they had been, a Spanish colony, restive but contained, waiting for a moment of imperial weakness that had not yet arrived. Without Puerto Rico, without Guam, without the Philippines, without Cuba as a protectorate, the United States of 1900 remained what it had been in 1890, a continental power with continental concerns. The absence of overseas territories meant no colonial administration to establish, no indigenous populations to govern, no military bases to construct across the Pacific. American political energy flowed instead toward domestic challenges. The trusts that dominated steel, oil, and railroads faced intensified scrutiny. Infrastructure investment accelerated railways, canals, the beginnings of a modern highway system. The labor movement grew, clashing with industrialists in strikes that dominated newspaper coverage where war dispatches might otherwise have appeared. McKinley won re-election in 1900, but on a platform of prosperity and stability rather than imperial expansion. His opponent, William Jennings Bryan, found the anti-imperialism argument that might have resonated neutralized by the simple absence of an empire to oppose. The election turned on silver, on tariffs, on the bread and butter issues that had defined American politics for generations. America remained powerful, growing more powerful by the year. But its power projected inward, not outward. The great question of what role the United States would play in the wider world remained, for now, unanswered. Spain's reprieve lasted barely a generation. The empire that had survived 1898 did not survive the pressures unleashed by 1914. When the great powers of Europe plunged into war, Spain remained neutral but could not escape the economic chaos that followed. German submarines disrupted Atlantic trade. Inflation ravaged the Spanish economy. The military, humiliated by decades of colonial quagmires, grew increasingly politicized. By 1920, Cuba had negotiated its independence through exhausted Spanish acquiescence rather than American liberation. The republic that emerged bore the imprint of Spanish institutions, Spanish law, Spanish political culture. There was no Platt Amendment granting America the right to intervene. There was no Guantanamo Bay naval base. Cuba entered the world as a Spanish-speaking nation shaped by its long struggle against Madrid, not by its relationship with Washington. The Philippines followed a decade later, achieving independence through a similar process of imperial decay and negotiated withdrawal. Aguinaldo, elderly but still alive, witnessed the moment he had fought for, though it had come through patience rather than American intervention. And the United States, when it finally emerged as a global power after 1945, did so as a nation without the institutional memory of colonial governance, without the habits of overseas empire, without the assumptions that came from decades of administering distant territories. The path to superpower status ran through different terrain, shaped by different choices, producing a different understanding of what American power meant and how it should be wielded. One technical report, delivered on a February morning in 1898, had bent the arc of history, not dramatically, not immediately, but inexorably, like water wearing away stone.